Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to my media platform at Family Office TV. I'm also the founder and CEO at SFO Continuity and, of course, Family Office Masterclass. You can all reach me very simply at angelorobles.com. It's great to be back. It's been a very, very busy week for me. It's exciting. And today we're covering Swiss and, to some degree, EU family office legal structures. Of course, an exciting topic, one that I know for those of you that are considering a family office or have one is an incredibly important subject. Many of you who follow me regularly know that earlier this week with Richard Levine at Withers, I covered this topic more specifically for U.S. families setting up U.S. structures. But I am very international. I'm actually going to Europe, to Austria specifically, in about a week and a half. That will be mid-December, depending on when you're potentially hearing this. I'm a huge advocate of Switzerland and of Americans specifically thinking more globally, being more diverse and having optionality. So the conversation today, yes, it's going to be about Swiss quote unquote family offices. We'll cover briefly some other aspects of Europe. Some of the concepts and principles, no matter where, are going to be relatively similar. But if you're a US family, don't just give up. There absolutely is going to be strong advantages, especially if you're larger scale, to setting up some structures that could be offshore, which I would highly recommend, and specifically in Switzerland. On that note, we do have the perfect guest today. That would happen to be, it's been a couple of years, but a return of Marnin Michaels. He's senior partner at Baker McKinzie in their Swiss or Switzerland office. Marnin is noted as a senior partner at the firm. He's been practicing for over 20 years in tax and wealth management. His practice ranges from insurance matters to tax investigations for both international families and institutions. He's widely regarded as one of the world's leading wealth management lawyers and is a former chair and co-chair of the regional and global wealth management steering committees. As noted, he is based in Switzerland. Marnin, welcome back.
Thank you, Angelo. It's good to be back.
Thank you. And again, since my complete dedication and focus is on single family offices, this is a very, very important topic. No matter where I go around the world, conceptually, there are some similarities to the concept that we're talking about. Normally, the family will, of course, have assets, or they wouldn't be a quote-unquote super rich family. So they have asset holdings, AKA sometimes they may call it an investment fund, and the other structure, simply their family office or AKA management company. Now that sounds simple and perhaps should be on the surface, but it gets a little complicated. So speaking specifically from a Swiss perspective, if I'm setting up a single family office, the actual management company, what would be the trends and best practices that I would do and structures I would use in setting one up?
So, Angelo, thank you for raising this question. One of the big challenges that I find families when they're thinking about setting up operations in Switzerland, which is important that they do because there's an opportunity for global diversification that you can find with the financial institutions here, that you can find here that you oftentimes cannot find in other parts of the world. However, having said that, what we're finding more and more is the idea that a company that doesn't make money is an unacceptable model to the Swiss. So if you want to set up a family office, more and more what we're finding is you need to talk to the authorities in advance as to what they will accept as an acceptable profit margin to make the company run, what regulatory regimes, if any, apply, and further, how they're going to be compensated for the services received. It can't just be a company sitting by itself. It has to have a purpose. It typically has to have an income. It typically has to have an agreement with the tax authorities as to the basis for the income tax. Because now, as we're going into a new world with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, where every company in Switzerland is going to be subject to a 15% corporate tax rate, we need to make sure it's understood the basis by which income and profit is generated so we can pay tax on the limited amounts. We also have to make sure that people working there are employed. If they're employed, are they living in Switzerland or are they not living in Switzerland? If they're not living in Switzerland, what are the consequences to that? Is the company going to be deemed to have a branch outside? If the company only has people working for it in Switzerland, how, where are they taxed? How are they taxed? Social taxes, pension plans. The days of just creating an AG, an AG, and just working, that's gone.
Okay, so you opened up a whole can of worms, but to some degree, not too different from in the US, late 2017 came down to Lender versus IRS. And honestly, one of the few cases that went to the highest level or among the highest levels of court were actually the family won. But it did set up a certain principle for treating it as a for profit entity. Therefore, what you're describing sounds to some degree a little bit similar. Uh, Now, let's get a little bit into the weeds. If we're going down that road, and there are advantages, like you said, which admittingly to some degree may be more limiting from the banking for a US family, but we'll get into that. Am I setting it up as a limited partnership? Is it a Swiss corporation, AKA an AG? What type of entity am I using? And then we'll weave in the employees, whether they're a family member, and if that matters, or there should be a key executive non-family member based in Switzerland, and is that going to matter?
Well, first, Switzerland doesn't have a limited partnership concept. So almost all of these types of vehicles are bodies corporate. They're typically an AG or a GmbH, AG or GmbH. And more that we see these structures as, particularly with connections to the US, as GmbH, but oftentimes they're AG. And they're companies, and they typically have names that have nothing to do with the family so that they can sort of blend in. But ultimately, everyone knows who's running them. And the key point there is those companies will typically have roles. They can have roles from doing asset management to managing the properties in Europe, to managing the boats, the other type. I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word boats. I was told the word I should be using is vessel. Okay. To managing the vessel, managing the airplane based in Europe, and all those things get done. And the question is, how are they paid for that? Okay. And typically that requires a discussion with the tax administration where the company is based. I typically urge these companies to be based in the cantons in which they're more tax friendly to these types of situations. Zug being a primary one, but not only Zug, Lucerne and others similar to that, where you can have an authority as to what the cost plus basis for taxation needs to be. And then you set up your operations and you go. The big challenge is finding the competency of people to work in this area. So typically, the best people to work in family offices in Switzerland you can find in Zurich and Geneva. Some in Basel, yes, that's true. But once you get out of those three, it's harder. Now, with respect to Zug, that's 20 minutes from Zurich, so people don't mind the commuting. But there's another jurisdiction which is not part of Switzerland that is used oftentimes also for family offices, which is on the border of Switzerland, called Liechtenstein. Why is that? Because Liechtenstein, its reputation is dramatically changed since 20, 25 years ago. It's viewed as a very white jurisdiction. It's viewed as they will become more compliant than everyone else. And more importantly, because it's in the European Economic Area, it is a jurisdictional entity that can operate in the EU without regulatory issues and in Switzerland without regulatory issues. So that creates another interesting opportunity. And again, you can have similar discussions with the tax authorities that you can in Switzerland.
Okay, that complicates matters, but makes it intriguing. So a reminder to my audience, most of them are used to here in the US where I am. In most other countries, there's a specific tax regime. If you could give a little bit of context to the canton's uniqueness within Switzerland, I guess perhaps also similarly, as you might have noted with Liechtenstein, that to some degree, for lack of a better word, depending on the value you're bringing to that local community and broadly the country, it's somewhat a negotiation. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I would say, Angelo, it's actually much more similar to the U.S. than I think people give credit for. There is one difference, which I'll come back to, and that is in the U.S. as an example, or in Canada as an example, there is arbitrage between the states. And there's arbitrage even within communities as to give incentives to bring people to do business. And there are some states that are known to be more regulatory friendly, more business friendly than others. I would suggest when you think of Switzerland, you think of it a bit the same way, that some are more regulatorily friendly, some are more tax friendly, some are more business friendly, and others are not. For example, Geneva is very, very liberal. Zurich is very, very liberal. You go to some of the other cantons like Appenzell, very conservative. You go to Zug, very business friendly. It's very much the same thing. Here is the fundamental difference between the US and Switzerland as an example in this context. In the US, the federal tax is the big tax. And
Yes.
therefore, where you do business on the state level is excuse the expression, it's a little bit nibbling around the edges. Where in contrast in Switzerland, the corporate rate in Switzerland is relatively, on the federal level, is relatively low, and also on the individual level is relatively low, and the big tax is on the cantonal level and the municipal level. And so that's the big difference. Where you pick, there can be huge differences. Where I'm sitting right now in Zurich, the individual income tax rate is as high as about 45%. I go 20 minutes, it's high, it's 20%. And by the way, there's social taxes where there's no cap. In Zurich, the corporate income tax is, I believe, 20% or 21%, where in Zug right now it's 11%. Now, this will harmonize because of various international rules that no one will be below a 15% rate. But it's not only about the taxes, it's about the friendliness in which you can have discussions. So there are even some relatively high tax cantons, like Lugano, like Valais, where they are high tax, but you can have a meaningful discussion with the authorities to come to an understanding as to how to approach things.
And you did mention before, maybe a couple of minutes ago, that there's, I think, upcoming, or maybe it's already in place. I think you mentioned 15%. Would that be their variation in Switzerland of what I would consider more of a federal? So is that going to be a minimum baseline for a corporation that they're going to pay?
Well, this is a new global baseline. This is called Pillar 1, Pillar 2 from the OECD, which is effectively creating a global standard that all companies in all jurisdictions must have a base corporate tax rate. The idea is to stop tax arbitrage between countries based on a lower rate, to have a basic minimum rate globally. And so that 15% rate is not only going to apply in Switzerland, it's going to apply globally.
So then on top of that, depending on what canton, so if you're setting it up as a corporation is different than an individual. So you're going to have a corporate tax rate, but if there's and I know it's a single family office, so it's different in terms of its real business purpose. But as you have distributions from that, then people are also going to be taxed individually.
Yes, correct. And now if you have a dividend distribution, there will be a tax. Typically, if you have greater than 10% of the company, it gets a preferred rate, similar to the US 15%. In Switzerland, in the German-speaking cantons, it's half of the normal income tax rate. So if the individual rate in Zurich is 45 or 46%, if you have a company and you own greater than 10%, the dividend is half that rate at about 20-something%. In contrast to, say, Zug, where it's 20% and it becomes 10%, or 21% it becomes 10%. That delta does exist and does make a difference. In the context of family offices, I very rarely have seen the family dividend out a lot of profit.
Right.
What I've typically seen is the profit is used to pay bonuses to the outside staff.
And then bonuses are considered a tax deductible for the corporation?
Tax deductible for the company.
And suppose the staff includes family members that are active as involved to some degree in the assets of the family.
Well, you may be able to pay the family members a salary. But
Correct.
if many of the family members are living in Switzerland on a lump sum tax deal, which is a flat rate tax, oftentimes called a Pauschalbesteuer or a forfait,
Mhm.
the family members cannot take an income, because if they take an income, they would be outside the scope of their agreement, which is that they cannot work in Switzerland.
Yes, and that gets a little complicated from a variety of different perspectives. Where do I kind of start on that one? Uh, some family members are qualified, and for them to be active in the family office in some sort of senior role is perhaps legitimate. Uh, Therefore, like you said, though, if that negates the advantages they have from the tax perspective that was negotiated relative to that canton and that
Mhm.
family, that does complicate matters. In theory, could they work in a board position or within the family and not receive compensation?
So I have the question of whether or not a board position, the question of a board position is income is an area that's a gray area, and that you have to pre-discuss it with the applicable tax administration in the relevant jurisdiction, and it can or cannot be an issue that's a breach. Now, more often than not, I've seen board positions be acceptable.
Okay, I mean, some of the things I'm starting to pick up, and I think it's important for the
Mm.
audience, that is different than here in the United States, especially since the cantons may be the higher of the taxes, which again is different than a state and a
Not
federal
maybe,
perspective.
always are, always are.
Always are. Now, again, there is that 15% minimal that is now being enacted. So that may
Mhm.
change a little bit of some of that dynamic. But the bigger point that I'm picking up is this is a little bit fluid and subject to, if I could call it the word negotiation. We're not quite used to that here in the US and probably in most other countries. Therefore, when considering setting up for advantages in Switzerland, and we'll get a little bit to that and maybe Liechtenstein
Mhm.
shortly as well. It's kind of important you have someone, perhaps like yourself and others, that understand inside and out the regulation and are effectively good negotiators with, let's call it the government. How important is that?
Well, I would actually go a step further, Angelo, and that is you have to help the family pick where we're going to set up the operation, and then pick the right person to have the discussions. So, for example,
Yes.
in some cantons, my firm will not do the negotiations, because it doesn't make sense for my firm to do negotiations in some of the mountain cantons where they don't know you. You have to go to a local lawyer to handle the negotiations. Now, oftentimes we will definitely be in the background. We'll be helping draft the documents, but you pick the local person. In some cantons, it doesn't matter. Okay, in some cantons, it doesn't matter. But in more and more cantons, who you pick matters a lot.
And a little bit of weaving in from the United States perspective, meaning someone who may even have dual citizenship but still has a green card or a passport here in the US. So they're going to be subject to the incredibly onerous US tax system that follows them around the world of the IRS. So there's going to be, I'm assuming, no real tax arbitrage per se for an American citizen. But that
Mhm.
doesn't negate the value of setting up the family office or a satellite family office in Switzerland or perhaps Liechtenstein or another country. You gave some
Mhm.
examples why earlier. Not
Yes.
tied as much to one system, a little bit more
Mhm.
global diversity, opportunity for maybe investments or resources they may otherwise not get. It may be a little bit of a powder keg question, but I'll leave it up to you to answer. If I'm an American citizen and I have a family office here, and I do want to consider setting one up, let's assume in the right canton in Switzerland, and I'm not getting tax arbitrage, I understand that, but I want to get certain access and resources. Am I going to be limited in certain banking relationships, even though I'm super wealthy, because I am an American citizen?
So there were a lot of things you just raised, and I'd like to decompact them and approach them one at a time. First of all, one of the things that I hate with a capital H is people who have a liquidity event and feel like they need to have certain status symbols because they had a liquidity event. Like they have to have the vessel, they have to have the plane, and they have to have a family office. I actually would argue that before anyone sets up a family office, and I know on this channel it's probably a gutsy thing to say.
Yes, you may get punished for this, Martin. Let's
Okay,
see what
it's
you
a
got to
gutsy thing
say.
to say. I actually going to say that
Uh,
one should think long and hard before setting up a family office. One, two, one may consider a interim solution involving a multi-family office or a shared services understanding with regard to shared services before one takes the bold step of setting something up completely. Now, I'm sure Angela is about to hit me with having said that, but what I have seen time and time again is people want to say, "Oh, I want to go into Switzerland." Okay, great. Well, I want to go into Switzerland. Why? Well, I understand I get certain access to items, or there's a vague understanding. Well, my friend did this. Well, here's the challenge with that: the minute you rent a space, an office space, more often than not, the lease is going to be between 5 and 10 years. More often than not, you're going to have to set up an IT infrastructure. More often than not, you're going to have employees. That's expensive, and it can get very expensive very fast. So I'm a big fan of walk before you can run. And there are oftentimes what I'll call shared service relationships that effectively allow you to have a family office, but which you're sharing services with others so that you're not taking on very large costs ab initio. So that to me is a big one that I see oftentimes, because what I see is if one realizes it's a mistake, the cost of shutting it down can be very expensive. You know, you have 6 employees and you're living in Switzerland, as an example, then depending on the canton or the city, you may actually have what's deemed a mass termination, and you may have to have some sort of social plan that you have to pay for people for a very long time when you're
yes.
laying off a mass group. And so that's the first thing. I always have to say, first and foremost, one. Two, there's a real reason to be in a place like Switzerland, and that is, well, I have great respect for the US financial institutions, and I have great respect for the US as a market. The challenge that I oftentimes see with being based in the United States, or solely based in the United States, is it's a very US focused model. The investments are typically primarily focused in the US, denominated in dollars, without a diversification. One.
Exactly.
Two, you don't get jurisdictional diversification, meaning what if the banking system teeters or other things teeter?
Oh, and
That's
of course,
avoidable.
that can't happen here. Really?
Well, it happens there. It happens here too. I mean,
True, but
it happens
diversity.
here too. But diversity matters. Um, you know, uh, Earlier this year we had some failures. Here we had some failures. The key point is, the one thing I've seen in my almost 27 years of practice now is putting all your eggs in one basket guarantees you end up with a big scramble, and doesn't necessarily mean a good big scramble. Although I like eggs, and I must say sometimes they come out very nicely. But the, I have seen families only survive because they took a piece of their assets and kept them separate and were able to rebuild. There's one family I
100.
work with. There's one family I work with that um, had their assets expropriated in the 1970s.
Mhm.
And there was a small operation in Switzerland. And with that small operation, they were able to rebuild a multi-billion-dollar business because they could expropriate the company, but the clients and the relationships and everything else connected to that was owned by the family. And you can't take that away. Now, the other big thing, as we're now living through multiple wars, we're back to what I'll call back to 1980s planning, which is be prepared to run. And I've actually given whole discussions about this one, which is if someone's threatening to kill you or threatening to hurt you, expect that they're threatening to hurt you. That's a fact, okay? And someone with a Ukrainian wife and a very large percentage of their friends and family living in Israel, I'm speaking from example right now, on both sides. You never know where the world is going to come. And I must say, some of the models that people thought were nuts over the last 20 years of central consolidation has turned out to be a mistake. And what we're going to see now is more going back to the planning that existed during the Cold War, which is standalone entities in different jurisdictions for protection. For protection. And to me, having an operation in Switzerland is because I can say a lot of negative things about Swiss banks, and I have said a lot of negative things about Swiss banks. The one thing they do very well is give the average investor access to the global capital market system in a way that other places don't. That's fantastic. Two, multi-currency in most financial institutions in North America is a rarity. I know there's some that can do it, but it's rarity and expensive. Here, I think my bank, I have 9 different currency sub-accounts for myself, and I'm not a wealthy guy. And they range from Swiss franc to euro to pounds to Israeli shekel to a Turkish lira. Don't ask me why I need a Turkish lira, but I need a Turkish lira account. That's what I have, and I have British pounds also. And the key here is, if you want a diversified portfolio, it's easier to get access to these types of items, investments here. That's one. Two, many families are global in nature today. The days of, mom was from New York, dad was from Washington, and they lived in Philadelphia, and they raised their family in Philadelphia, and everyone was in that 300-mile radius. That's over. Today, mom is from New York, dad is from Hong Kong, the kids live in Singapore and Toronto and Brazil, and maybe someone living in Europe. They naturally live in lots of different places. They have assets in different places. It's easier to maintain assets when you're near them than when you're far from them. And that is a large reason that goes into family offices these days. So I see that as a big component as to why they're set up. And in my opinion, more often than not, it starts with someone having a home they want to take care of, or a business they want to take care of, or they want certain access to assets that they can't otherwise get, and that becomes relevant. Now, with respect to the regulatory side, I'd like to just point out that for US regulatory purposes, not tax, regulatory, someone who's an American citizen living outside the United States is not a US person for securities law. So that could mean that someone who thinks they have a regulatory issue, you need to look at it and address that. Having said that, if you have a family where many of the family are living in the United States, as an example, you do have the regulatory issue, and that is you have to address with U.S. Investment Advisor Act, Broker-Dealer Act, commodities, and all sorts of other items of that nature. And there are a few banks that won't work with U.S. persons as a policy. That is true. Most banks will work with U.S. persons provided 2 things happen. One, the appropriate tax form to allow reporting of the U.S. persons are given. And 2, a relevant registered investment advisor with the relevant registrations and or licenses is around to help. So more often than not, I know most banks in Switzerland will deal with U.S. residents, but they require an SEC registered investment advisor to help. Now, the challenge with picking an SEC registered investment advisor in the US is, if the point is to get diversification, then picking someone in the US doesn't exactly help you. But there's at least 85 that I can think of off the top of my head, US registered investment advisors based in Switzerland, which effectively get divided into 3 groups. One are what I'll call dedicated or part of a financial group. So banks like Safra, banks like Von Tobel, banks like Pictet have registered investment advisors that are part of the group that solely service the group. And then you have what I'll call third-party external asset managers, where they have the applicable registration, and with that registration, they can bank with any bank, and that they're not dependent on any bank. And so they can even be with banks like Julius Baer, who doesn't have an SEC registration, or historically with Credit Suisse that didn't have an SEC registration. So that was something that was clearly possible, or is clearly possible. There's a third group of our registered investment advisors that probably is less of a relevance to this conversation, but there are registered investment advisors that are proprietary for banks outside of Switzerland. So, for example, there are, Bank of America, as an example, has a registered investment advisor here, but it's not open to the public. It's for Bank of America clients who would like some global diversification. That's also there, or also servicing the institution themselves.
Wow, that was a very comprehensive answer to my question, and it went off in some different areas that I really am glad you went in those directions, because this is kind of an international discussion, at least as much in an hour and 15 minutes that we could squeeze in. And you gave some hope for the American citizen, green card holder, whatever it may be, to still have an operational setup, let's call it broadly, in Switzerland, and have access to banking and resources, especially if they have that kind of money. They have an entity that is contributing to Swiss society, aka the family office, and employing people, having access to more diversity than they would get here in the US. I want to give a comment on that. Most of my audience knows I'm the creator of, as I mentioned, Family Office Masterclass. For years, and I've been called, Angelo, what are you doing? I've been talking about sovereign risk and disaster preparedness. These families are already rich. Do they want to get richer? Of course they do, but they rather not lose what they have. And citizens around the world, outside of the US, they know, if they go back generations, that things go wrong. And we're seeing things going wrong around the world right now in a drastic way. We have tremendous political bifurcation here in the US. We have lots of problems here, including banks that have went under. I think the US is awesome. I always want to be a US citizen. I got my 10-gallon cowboy hat and I love Wyoming. But I think it's important, and I've been talking about it, for families of wealth to have optionality, multiple passports, become more of a global citizen, which organically that's kind of happening, and have diversity in your trust and resources and your business interest around the world. Does that make your life more complicated? Yes. But if it assures continuity in the family and having optionality in case something happens, in case lockdowns happen and you're limited relative to one passport. I don't know, like maybe having an EU or a Swedish passport a couple of years ago for some of you would have been great in terms of your optionality and what you perceive as freedom. And I understand people of wealth don't want to be limited. They enjoy, probably the number one thing they believe their wealth provides them is their freedom and optionality. And for many people, that's very important. What Marnin said was 100% spot on, not about single family offices, by the way, we'll get to that in a second, but about US citizens being incredibly wickedly over dollar denominated. The world is changing. I'm not so sure the dollar is going to be the world reserve currency 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. There's already issues with the BRICS and what's going on there and competition. And there's lots of other things that we're not going to have the time to get into, but having a diversity of currencies, including the ones Marnin mentioned, maybe even the krona, the Singapore dollar, and others, I think is very important. You have to think more globally, please. And yes, bluntly, my programs, especially for an American-centric organization, are by far the most diverse in thinking of sovereign risk and challenges from that perspective. Relative to what Marnin said about the SFO, I don't disagree per se. I've always said most SFOs are really not that good. Unfortunately, I think most MFOs are not that good. It's a little different in terms of in Switzerland and other parts of the world. But I think effectively, if you're going to do a family office, do it right, have great people, pay them incredibly well, and best practices. And again, that's the core of what I do. So it's something I do get a little quote unquote passionate about.
And I'm glad you do. And by the way, I'm a big fan, for the record, I'm a big fan of single family offices. I'm also a big fan in well-run single-family offices.
Well, then
And
you're a big fan of only about 10 or 15% of single family offices.
correct, correct, correct. But what I'm also a big fan of is I literally had this example happen this year. Family had a liquidity, I'm sorry, this year had a liquidity event, a $400 million liquidity event. Their first reaction was, let's build a single family office.
God, I love this family, Martin. They should have reached out to me.
I don't think you speak the language that they could speak with you.
Well, I could have an intermediary.
Okay, okay. I had to use one of my languages that is not English to speak with them. And my challenge with that is what they invested in the first 6 months. I am not sure whether that was the best investment in the first 6 months of the liquidity event, where had they slowed it down a little bit, they would, I think over time they'd had a better family office. I just feel in that case, from building an IT platform to hiring 7 people, I was uncomfortable that they ran before they walked, and that was the only thing I was trying to say. I am a big fan of the single family office, but Angela, I want to come back to a couple of things you just said. I'll just use my kids. Okay, my kids have 3 passports. Okay, they have a Swiss passport, they have an EU passport, and they have a Ukrainian passport. Why? People say, well, why do you need an EU passport if they have a Swiss passport? Well, my view is the relationship between Switzerland and the EU is getting so bad that I think either the Swiss will withdraw from their agreements with the EU or the EU will kick them out. So I'd like to have my kids have the right to live in Europe without having an issue. And because of where my wife's family is from, they were eligible for other types of citizenship, like a Romanian passport, which is EU. And by the way, for the record, there's no rule in the EU that says an Austrian passport is better than a Romanian passport or a Bulgarian passport. Once you're EU, EU is EU. It's the same. And my wife's Ukrainian, so they got it by virtue of being the child of Ukrainian. Now, having said that, there's another element which I would say for this audience is super important. There's a difference between citizenship and the right to live someplace. And I would encourage all of the people on this call to consider, can I get a relatively tax neutral residency in Europe? Should there be another another COVID that allows me to go to Europe? Or the UAE as an example, something goes wrong, do I have a safety valve? I always hear people say citizenship, citizenship, citizenship. To me, residency and the right to live somewhere is equally as important.
Very good points. And again, for the tax arbitrage for a U.S. citizen or green card holder, effectively that's not there. But there are other advantages to having freedom of movement, access to resources, etc. And for some American citizens, they may elect, it's their call, if they want to pay the, 23.9% exit tax. Which, again, I do remind people all the problems that we have. There are way more people looking to want to come into the U.S. than wealthy people looking to leave. But again, it's understandable in terms of what the options are and having clarity on that. Given that you brought it up, you almost hinted that for maybe some or most families, the domicile of Liechtenstein from a single family office management company perspective may be a better option for some. Do you want to double down on that? Why is that a better option?
I will happily double down on it. I have more and more clients who want to be relatively close to a major airport,
right?
Have relatively good access to resources that exist in Zurich, as an example, but want to be part of the EEA. They want to be part of the European Economic Area. They want to be part of the EU and not part of the EU. So you see a lot of families, particularly that have EU connections, to want to be in the EU. And I must say, cost-wise, it's probably the same, whether it's Switzerland or Liechtenstein. In fact, Liechtenstein may even be a little bit higher, but that benefit of being within the European Economic Area and being in a jurisdiction where you can have meaningful conversations at the highest level of government, which is sometimes a benefit.
Okay. And looking at Europe broadly, we discussed, again, really a tiny sliver with Switzerland, even less so of Liechtenstein. We went over some of the core issues. How about the UK? Would a family in the UK benefit from having operations headquartered, quote unquote, in, meaning family office operations in Switzerland, in Liechtenstein? Are there certain advantages to being in the city of London in the UK?
So let's talk about the UK. The UK is another hub for family offices.
Yes, that's why I brought it up.
Why? Because it is still a center of financial markets, and it's still a center of financial access, and people want to be there. Having said that, with the potential, with the likelihood that Rishi does not win re-election, which is high, with the likelihood that we get a Labour government in place, with the likelihood that Labour will win and will abolish the res non-dom regime, you still show people setting up operations in the UK, but everyone in the UK is having contingency plan. What happens if you get a more challenging government than you have now? And that is really the challenge. Now, I still think people will have family offices there, but we're going to a much more challenging environment to work. It is not the London of 30 years ago. It is the London of a post-Brexit world, which is struggling financially. I mean, the UK effectively shot itself in the foot with Brexit because they're not part of the EU, but they have to comply with almost all EU regulations because their largest trading partner is the EU. So you have that. There are a couple other places where you're seeing family offices being set up right now. Spain and Portugal are big ones at the moment. Why? Because for families from Latin America, using certain of the tax benefits that now exist in Spain, Beckham or Golden Visa in Portugal, for people with language, where language is an important point, people are setting up family offices there in relatively more friendly jurisdictions compared to, say, the UK at the moment, although many of them still have their family offices in the UK. And the other place is Italy, where you're seeing.
All right, my cultural heritage, or at least part of it.
Because Italy has a lump sum deal of €100,000 a year flat tax. So a lot of people are setting up their operations there because they're nearby. And plus, even if, most wealth owners, if they're going to have a place in Europe, they're either going to have it in the south of France or going to have it in Italy.
Exactly.
And so there's a logic to that. But even recently, I saw family offices set up in Greece, which has some very interesting tax benefits and other benefits to set up an operation there to encourage that business because they have a similar type of regime. And also Cyprus. And I know Cyprus right now has some bad press because of the Cyprus leaks and the perception that it's used by Russians. But I have to say, more and more clients I see are also using Cyprus as an option because there's really 30 years or 40 years of real quality people having developed there. Plus, it's nice, it's warm, and the food is not bad. It's not as good as Italy, but it's good.
Yes, and I also, not just because of partial cultural heritage on my part, but Italy has many advantages, including, depending on what part of Italy, besides, of course, culture, food, architecture, the great tax benefits to a degree that you're noting, but it is proximity to Switzerland and some of the other quote unquote more maybe tax and central financial hubs where I could argue, depending on things go wrong, is kind of a car ride away. Now, I don't want to do that.
And I go a step, and Angelo, I'll go a step further. I actually have clients who have family offices in Milan and a family office in Switzerland.
Absolutely.
for that purpose. Not because there's any hedging, but if there's something wrong, there's a challenge. And also, they can choose where they beef up the structure based on where the law is going in those jurisdictions at the time.
And a slight change of direction. So we spoke, again, as much as we could in 40 minutes on a very complex subject with multiple countries involved in the EU, Switzerland, et cetera, broadly in Europe on the management structure. But the family has assets. They have real estate interests, let's broadly call it, around the world. They have multiple bank accounts, multiple custodial accounts, private companies. You have to intertwine the management company and how it works as a for-profit entity, managing the resources of the family that are globally diversified. And this now, again, in the lender versus IRS for U.S. families or U.S. family offices, it laid a little bit of a groundwork of what could work in the future. And some of the higher quality attorneys are running with that. How does the intertwining of assets with the internationally structured Liechtenstein, Italy, Portugal, Swiss, SFO management company, meaning the assets could be completely out of that country?
Well, let's talk about the family office is what I'll call a tool. It's the mechanism that allows certain activities to occur. More often than not, the wealth is held, or the underlying assets are held in sort of a global structure, whether that's a trust, a Liechtenstein foundation, a Panamanian foundation, or another type of vehicle that makes sense for the family to hold the assets. And that is independent of the family office. Very rarely do you see the family office holding many billions of dollars of assets being managed. Maybe for some Swiss families, you'll have a Swiss company that has a good tax ruling holding the assets for a Swiss family, but that's an exception, not the rule.
Yes. But there still needs to be a, let's call it a business arrangement agreements that my family office is, and maybe I'll be careful with that word, it's an entity in and of itself, but it has varying shareholders, AKA the corporation that owns it. And I mean, we could also get into that issue, but we're opening up such a deep can of worms. Okay, why not?
But it's fun. It's fun. So let's blow
if it's a corporation in Switzerland that technically is the owner of the single family office, who the hell holds the shares of the corporation? Is it individuals? Is it a family trust? Is it an irrevocable trust?
It depends on where the family is living. More often than not, I see the single family office owned by one of two possibilities: the wealth owner, or some form of private trust company.
Yes.
That holds the asset so that there is no owner.
And we're going to get a little bit to private trust companies, but yes, that does make sense. But there still needs to be agreements between the SFO, aka management company corporation in this case, with the underlying,
and that's contractual.
20, 300 entities where the assets are held. And
that's contractual.
Correct. Meeting audience, it's actually pretty straightforward, but it should be done, and the I should be dotted, the T should be crossed. And that's a problem with a lot of family offices, is they don't update their structures to be optimized. They're probably running afoul of multiple certain country regulatory issues. And if it wasn't for the fact that the countries are overburdened, even though they would love to go after the super rich per se and get more of their capital and make note of them and drag it out a little bit in public, they sometimes just don't have the resources. But that's no excuse for you as an ultra wealthy family, or the buck also begins a little bit with the underlying family office executive or head. You have to be responsible for these things. You have to be on top of it. You should be doing an annual review. How can you best optimize the structures in your family office? Stop being ignorant to that. These things are incredibly important. And at least here in the US, may have millions of dollars of tax ramifications if they're not, quote unquote, done right. Let's talk a little bit about, I would call it cringe here in the US. Why do so many wealthy families with existing operating companies, meaning still an existing business, they're wealthy, they have a so-called embedded into their family business, family office, where they're people that are formally with the corporation or the company, and they're doing crossover work personally for the family. There's a variety of privacy, regulatory, probably breaking a variety of different guidelines. I do not like embedded family offices. What's the take from a European and a Swiss perspective? And why don't more families realize they're completely different and bifurcate them and do it properly?
Well, I don't like it either. But having said that, I would say 9 times out of 10, it's what I see. Because this is okay. Because here's what happens as a practical matter. The person's running the business, and the guy says, "Listen, I just need someone to help me with the financial stuff. Hire an assistant that helps me." Then it's a second person, then a third person. It's never planned that there'll be a family office within the operating business. It just naturally happens over time. Plus, I hate to be obnoxious about it, is that most jurisdictions haven't really focused on the fact
Right.
that those people are not really working for the company. And then obviously you get a business deduction for their salaries. That's a big reason why it doesn't stop.
Yes, you nailed it. I didn't want to necessarily go too much in that direction, but that's the reality of it.
Yeah, it's historic. I mean, listen, I have no problem with it. It's historical, and in closely held businesses, or even, and I be clear, I have a very deep distrust of this in publicly held businesses. In closely held businesses, I really don't have a problem with it, because in the end of the day, in a closely held business, family business and the business and personal are all so blurred that it doesn't really bother me. And if you have trusted people, maybe you don't care if it's known within the family. And let me tell you something, in a family business, every employee knows all the crap going on with the family anyway.
Yeah, I guess in the US or out of the US, that's the same anywhere around the world. That is for sure. Again, we could make this a half day, 1 day, 2 day masterclass. And Lord knows I love my masterclasses, and my dream team, which someone like Marnin and his great intellect and resources is a big part of. So I'm happy on my Family Office TV to share effectively, I hope, what you deem to be very intellectual, deep content in a community that rarely gives you that. A lot of it's fluff. A lot of events are completely sponsor driven and lacking really any sort of deep intellectual rigor. And I've been in the community a long time. I take pride in my level of competency, and for, at least by an American standards, being somewhat of a global citizen, well-traveled, and understanding that the world doesn't always revolve around the US, and it's complicated. It's becoming more of a global world, yet it's becoming also decoupled in certain ways, and going back a little bit to how things used to look, like you said, in the 80s. And for families to understand geopolitics, economics, and having a global perspective, if they care about family continuity, if they care about doing things right and optimizing their benefits and the opportunity for them to continue, yes, these are all things that they need to be engaged in. And someone like me in an organization like mine and the resources, including Marnin and others that you heard on my program, are absolutely a part of that. We can't really do it justice, but we'll gloss on it a little bit as we take it to the final, perhaps 10 minutes, Marnin. For families of great wealth, probably I would define as USD above 750 million, if not even a billion and up. It's more complicated than just simply, okay, you have your family office. Hopefully, again, it's done properly. You have resources, but you probably also are in consideration, not just of global assets and resources, and in my opinion, at minimum, a satellite, like you mentioned with the Italian family also having a family office in Switzerland, but intertwining of the ownership of banks in correct jurisdictions, captive insurers, and you did mention the all-important private trust company. In a couple of minute overview from your perspective of how all of this intertwines and kind of an asset protection and diversity strategy, why are those important?
Well, I'll tell you why I'm a big fan of having, with the right family, a regulated entity within the group, because there's no better asset protection than a regulator that will not let you pull capital out of an entity.
Yes. But by the way, those of you go back about 2.25 years, my interview with Marnin, we did about an hour and 20 minutes on advantages and challenges perhaps to buying into a Swiss bank. And there's a gazillion small private banks available. I'm not going to say they're profitable. I'm not going to say they're not antiquated and need major recapitalization and technology upgrades. So it's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart, but we do go deeper into that subject. If you were to go back about 2 years to, I think it was October actually of 2000.
It was October 2020. It was October 2020. And wow. I know that because I know that because I remember it was the day before we moved out of my old apartment. So it was October 2020.
Wow. So it's over 3 years. Time does go by. But yes, pardon my interruption, but continue.
Yeah. So I'm not saying for everyone, but for the right person and the right family, putting assets in a regulated entity means those assets are subject to the purview of a regulator, and money can't leave them without permission of the regulator. And that becomes a very interesting asset protection vehicle for the right family. Now, that is what I would call asset protection on the extreme level. Everyone knows about trusts in the Cook Islands and those types of issues. I really don't know how well they work. What I do know is they create a barrier to block assets that start a negotiation. But if those assets are back in the United States or in the UK and you have a claim there, they don't really work. But I have to tell you,
exactly.
I have seen that where you set up this elaborate structure in the Cook Islands and then the bank accounts in New York. But people do that. But a private trust company has the benefit of being there for the family, can have family involvement, but he's oftentimes not subject to regulation because it's only for a family, and can have professional benefits by even hiring a professional trust company to administer it. In fact, almost all the PTCs I'm involved with hire a professional trust company to run them.
And the concept of what we consider here in the U.S. a private trust company, and we look at domiciles probably like South Dakota being probably the optimal, but there's others, Nevada, Oklahoma, Wyoming, New Hampshire, etc. We have regulated in most jurisdictions, but some like Wyoming, you could actually have an unregulated, and they're actually incredibly cost effective and still give you the level of being a trustee of unique assets, of governance structures. How is it different in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or other countries, or the concepts of it are relatively similar?
It's not. And it's exactly the same concept. The question is whether you're using Guernsey, Jersey, or Isle of Man, maybe not Isle of Man anymore, Bahamas, BVI, Bermuda, Panama. And I have to tell you, I don't care where you go, so long as you're in a top tier jurisdiction.
Why not Switzerland?
Well, you can do Switzerland, and there are many trust companies in Switzerland. The problem is Switzerland doesn't have a trust law. And so you're always relying on a purpose trust based in a jurisdiction outside of Switzerland. And you can have a Swiss trustee and the like, but I know that causes challenges.
Yes, that could. And any specific commentary on the intertwining of captive insurers?
You know what? I'd rather pass on that, Angelo, just because I'm not an expert on captive insurance.
Got it. Like understood. So again, in approximately 1 hour, this was an incredibly complex subject, but I wanted to keep it somewhat concise and at least open up families to think and to ask questions. At minimal, I guarantee you 9 out of 10, even upper level family offices could all benefit, whether in the US or out of the US. At minimal, just are you running on all your cylinders? Is it as optimized as it could be? And the answer is there are things you could do that would likely enhance and improve it. Don't just assume that you're great and you're smart and everything you touch and what you build must be optimized. Maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago, but you haven't looked at it in such a long time. And it may help to have a second or even a third set of eyes give you interpretations and opinions as to what it could be so you can optimize it. Before I ask Martin to go into his closing comments, I will remind the audience, I guess a bit of a disclaimer. We're recording this in actually the last day of November, at least here in the US, November 30th of 2023. Rules and regulations change. Interpretations are sometimes subject to a level of opinion. This is simply for entertainment and to some degree educational purposes. But you may listen to this a day from now, a year from now, or 10 years from now, and one, regulatory issues could have absolutely changed. Global political issues absolutely could have changed. And perhaps even the opinion of the person, whether it's me, Marnin, or others, relative to an interpretation has now been adapted. So simply utilize this for entertainment purposes. At the end of the day, do your own diligence, make your own decisions, and be careful in anything you do. It may not work out the way you want it to. So understanding optionality and effectively the buck stops with you. Make your own decisions in terms of what you do. As I leave it to you, Marnin, to maybe give us a little bit of a closing commentary, whether it's non-US families or US families considering Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or Europe, in terms of their structures, and among the things we spoke about, and some we could have done a deeper dive, but again, that would make it a multi-hour, half-day, one-day masterclass, which perhaps is something that we could definitely do, because I do love that at a point in the future. But how would you conclude?
Well, I would conclude by saying it's a challenging topic, and there's no right answer for everyone, and that the solution has to work for the family's needs, and there's no right and there's no wrong. I sort of view family offices a bit like eating, which is everything is permissible so long as it's in moderation, and everything is permissible so long as there's some diversification in what you're doing. And I would view it that in the context of family offices for global families, it has to make sense for your needs, and don't double down or triple down on something, because that may not be healthy for you and it may cause other risks.
True. Martin, pardon me for stretching the time a little bit, and we could
Go
save
ahead.
this for a different discussion, or simply you could say it's just not what you're focused on. But a text came in from a friend of mine. You know, Angelo, you want to be Mr. Global, and so global, very kind of US, and I'm active in LATAM as well, and Europe, and I'm going there shortly. But how could you have a global conversation about family offices and not bring up Singapore and Asia, and perhaps Dubai, he mentioned, in the Middle East? I do have opinions about both. I'm more than happy in the future to do a deeper dive and share. And again, it's good to have optionality around the world. But if you had to, I'm probably putting you in an unfair spot, Martin, and maybe it's simply you'll pass. But any specific opinion about aspects of Asia or the Middle East in terms of family office structures?
So I'm a big fan of both Singapore and the Emirates, and I consciously use the word the Emirates because, or let me use the word the Gulf, because that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in Dubai. You can say what you want about political structures, like those you find in Singapore, lesser in Singapore and more in the in the Gulf, but that creates a level of stability. And I have to say, I very much appreciate that. And I would say it is an option. And I think it should be considered. If you have a family that is Asian focused, Singapore replaces Switzerland almost instantly. If you have a family that has no Asian connection, the time zone can kill you. And that's why you see a lot of families with no connection not going there. But that's there. On the other hand, I see a lot of families having a backup in the Emirates or in the Gulf or even in Riyadh, even in Tel Aviv, because there's a perceived stability of another option that is relatively easy to work with. Having said that, particularly with the failure, I shouldn't say failure is the wrong word, particularly with the choice of these jurisdictions not to impose sanctions on Russia, there are people who have a concern with being in those jurisdictions because they're worried about sanctioning. It's not my issue. I'm actually perfectly fine. I would actually one of the best person I ever hired went to run one of the big family offices in the UAE. So I am thrilled with family offices there. But I have to say, I wouldn't put all my eggs only in an Emirati family office, because I think there's perceptions, whether correctly or incorrectly, that there could be some things going on there that are not 100% comfortable to other jurisdictions. A portion, yes. A backup, 100%.
Broadly speaking, I agree. I think it's more complicated in terms of a response, but I put you on the spot without prep and giving a 2 or 3 minute answer to, again, a
And I
subject
blew it up. And I blew it
about.
up for you.
And you did a great job, of course. So I'm gonna, for a change, I'm actually gonna be a little quiet. I know that's rare, audience. You must be shocked by this. And okay, one final. Since I'm going to Europe, but very specifically Vienna and the surrounding area, December 11th, by the way, through the 18th. If you're a family office, I have a very tight schedule, but perhaps there's opportunities to meet or be involved. I'm staying at a lovely hotel, so those of you feel free to reach out to me. But Martin, while I happen to be there, I guess I don't look at Austria as being quite a perfect bailiwick for tax advantages, whatever, non-U.S. citizen or family office structures. But it does have a long history. It does have some intriguing private banks. It is close to some of the epicenters that we're describing. Is there anything specific about Austria that makes it unique from a single family office or family of great wealth perspective?
I think there's one big one, and that is, while Austria has many of the same characteristics of Switzerland, it has never been the subject to the level of attention that Switzerland has.
Huh.
And there's an element of under the radar screen in working with banks based in Vienna.
Interesting. Thank you. That allows me to probably know who to reach out to, assuming they even want to meet with me. But I have a couple of interesting meetings lined up, so I do look forward to my time, partially for 7 or 8 days this December in Vienna and broadly in Austria. It looks like a beautiful country, amazing architecture, great food. I look forward to having a great time and meeting some amazing people while I'm there. Martin, for those that would like to have an opportunity to learn more about you or reach out, how could they do so?
So I have the benefit of having one of the more unusual names out there, Marnin, Marnin. So if you just put Marnin and Switzerland, you will find me on Baker McKenzie's website, because there ain't a lot of Marnins. So it's easy to find me. My email is marnin.michaels@bakermckenzie.com. And you can find everything you want of me that way also. But Marnin is a very unusual name. There's only about 12 of us. And if you just put Marnin and tax lawyer, you find me.
Yes, and I highly encourage people to reach out. As you could tell in the short amount of time we had today, and I've known Martin for several years. He's one of the top legal minds globally, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to be introduced to him a couple of years ago, to keep a dialogue open, and to have a chance to share with my audience in kind of a free platform intellect that he charges a lot for. And kudos that he's able to share a good amount in relatively a short amount of time, which leads me a little bit into my close. This is an incredibly complex subject. It is a combination of art and science. So I said that earlier, and in prior conversations I've had on this subject. I absolutely think it's important to think internationally. It's very, very important. And actually, in some ways, especially for American families where they don't do that enough. Yes, it's complicated. No, we can't cover that perfectly in an hour and 10 minutes, which is why we also do things like I own, like Family Office Masterclass, and even for my members at SFO Continuity, some of the level of resources, deep intellectual resources and access that they get on these things that are very, very important. So yes, it is valuable to join, to participate in an intimate group like I created, or even the one-offs that I do for non-members at Family Office Masterclass, and participate. And like I do say, in relatively a short amount of time, really enhance your knowledge significantly more than the vast majority of people who might already even be in a family office. So I am completely dedicated to the single family office community and globally, not just in the US, and the opportunity for best practices in getting better. Like Jim Collins said, going from good to great, actually that 5 or 10% difference, it can be very, very hard. But having an opportunity of benchmarking, of best practices, of knowing important steps to take to potentially get there, and for family continuity is very important. And that effectively is 100% what I'm dedicated to. So follow me on my social media platforms, multiple on YouTube, obviously LinkedIn, Twitter, and others. I'm at angelorobles.com. You can reach me via email from there or simply call me. I believe my number is there on the contact screen. If not, again, and I love calls, WhatsApp, messages, text. It's all good. I'm happy to communicate. I am glad that people are communicating with me. It's always a pleasure, and I appreciate all of your time and very much look forward to my next discussion. Again, Marnin, thank you for your extra amount of time today. I appreciate it and look forward to our follow-up discussions.
Thanks, Angelo.